I'm going to present the module on mob psychology and crowd control. The learning outcomes of this module are to make the learners understand the various concepts of mob psychology and crowd control, to make the learners understand various theories of mob psychology and crowd control, to familiarize the learners with various methods and steps of mob psychology and crowd control. MacDougall, a renowned psychologist, had said, "A crowd is excessively emotional, impulsive, fickle, inconsistent, irresolute, and extreme in action, displaying only the coarser emotions and the less refined sentiments, extremely suggestible, careless in deliberation, hasty in judgment, incapable of any but the simpler and imperfect forms of reasoning, easily swayed and laid, lacking in self-consciousness, devoid of self-respect and of sense of responsibility. Hence, its behavior is like that of an unruly child, or it is like a wild beast." The mob has been mostly seen as a destructive entity by the law enforcement agencies, as it has often given splitting headaches to them. The psychology of a mob is interesting. People in a mob will act and react much differently than they will at other times. Otherwise, peaceful, law-abiding citizens can quickly turn angry and violent, committing atrocities as they express their displeasure in not finding answers. Together, those people are capable of doing anything, of committing the most heinous crimes. In this era of the vocal media and human rights activism, the law enforcement agencies often get criticized for indulging in human rights violation when dealing with the crowd. Controlling a crowd is indeed a gigantic task, which becomes even more complex in a country like India, where the mob may comprise of various groups based on religion, caste, class, region, profession, etc. It is imperative that the law enforcement agencies study about the psychology of the crowd, else it will not be possible to control the crowd effectively by only wielding the baton. Now let us talk about the theories of mob psychology. Let's step back a moment to the classic psychological theory on crowds, which gave rise to many of the tougher approaches taken today. Originating during the political instability of the 19th century France and later adopted by most 20th century social scientists, this thinking held that people in a crowd lost their individuality and became suggestible to the aggressive behavior of those around them. That view gave rise to the phrases like mob mentality and de-individuation, the idea of a crowd as a singular entity rather than a collection of independent people capable of thinking for themselves. Some of the most important theories regarding crowd behavior are Le Bon's theory, MacDougall's theory, Freud's theory, Alport's theory, Turner's theory. The study of collective behavior started with the study of crowd behavior in the 19th century. Crowd behavior was a significant area of study in the field of psychology. Early social psychologists such as Gustave Le Bon and Gabriel Tarde suggested the origins of crowd in their instincts and mass imitation. On this basis, Le Bon proposed mob psychology as a theory of crowd. Since then, sociologists have largely replaced psychological point of view of crowd behavior. They have shown that behavior in crowds is far more mindful, rational, and socially organized than Le Bon believed. Not only this, they have broadened the field and coined the new term collective behavior to include mob, riot, panics and craze, rumor, audience public and mass movements, along with the crowd. Many theories have been propounded by various psychologists and sociologists to explain why the crowd behaves in a particular way. The behavior of the crowd is always emotionally determined. The things common to all people are such fundamental emotions such as fear, anger, and rage. In terms of these common elements, crowds form, feel, and act. These provide a common bond and a basis for interaction in all conditions. In the crowd, the emotional tone is heightened by the concentration of attention, the suggestions of leaders, the use of verbal and other symbols, the excited gestures of the crowd members, and other circumstances of the occasion. On the basis of these emotional characteristics, the crowd is easily led. In the crowd, mostly critical faculties are in abeyance. Individuals accept as true the most improbable of statements. Now let us discuss Lee Bon's theory in details. According to Lee Bon, the earliest and main exponent of crowd behavior, the individual yields to instincts which had he been alone would be perforce have kept under restraint. Like the hypnotized person, he is no longer conscious of his acts. At the same time that certain faculties are destroyed, others may be brought to a high degree of exaltation. He is no longer himself, but he becomes an automation that has ceased to be guided by his will. In the crowd, he is barbarian. He possesses the spontaneity, the violence, the ferocity, and also the enthusiasm and heroism of primitive beings. While explaining the crowd behavior, Lee Bon developed his most important notion of group mind. Group mind makes people feel, think, and act in a manner quite different from that in which each individual would feel, think, and act were he in a state of isolation. The group mind is not a mere collection or the sum of the minds of all the individual members of a group. It is a mind of its own, distinct from minds working on different levels. Its working is based on emotions, appeals, suggestions, and slogans. Its acts are less rational and more emotional. It is an irresponsible mind focusing its attention on some immediate object. Its mental level is very low. It becomes easily excited and acts in a hypnotic way. It is on this account that individuals behave most irrationally in a crowd than otherwise behave individually. In jest, Lee Bon's ideas were that crowds emerge through the existence of anonymity, which allows a decline in personal responsibility. In contagion, ideas moving rapidly through a group, through a suggestibility. In the crowd, the individual psychology is subordinate to a collective mentality which radically transforms individual behavior. Lee Bon said that in periods of social decline and disintegration, society is threatened by the rule of crowds. Now let us discuss about MacDougall's theory. Psychologist William MacDougall, a theory of the behavior of unorganized groups or crowd, is practically the same as Lee Bon's. He explains the two central phenomena of crowd behavior, namely the intensification of emotion in a crowd and the lowering of intellectual level. The former is due to the principle of direct induction of emotion by way of primitive sympathetic response. He says, the greater the number of people in whom the same emotions can be simultaneously observed, the greater the contagion. The individual under the influence of emotion loses the power of criticism and slips into the same emotion. The collective emotion becomes intensified by mutual interaction. The intensification of emotion and unpreparedness for opposing the authority of the crowd in their turn inhibits intellectual processes and the lowering of intellectual level in a crowd. Now let us discuss about Freud's theory. MacDougall's theory of sympathetic induction that accounts for the intensification of emotion is not accepted by all scholars. Sigmund Freud, in his essay on group psychology and analysis of ego, remarks, "There is no doubt that something exists in us, which, when we become aware of signs of emotion, how often do we not successfully oppose, resist the emotion and react in quite an opposite way? Why, therefore, do we invariably give way to this contagion when we are in a group?" Freud traces it to our indirect impulses. Freud suggests that what holds any group together is a love relationship, that is, emotional ties. This explains what he considers to be the principal phenomenon of group psychology. Using psychoanalytic approach of Freud, D. Martin interpreted crowd behavior as the release for repressed drives. Through a crowd, the restraints of a superego are relaxed and primitive ego impulses come into play. The censor within the individual is set aside in the crowd, and the instinct or basic id impulses, which are normally confined to the inner depths of the personality, come to the surface. The crowd thus provides a momentary release of otherwise repressed drives. How far the Freudian theory is helpful in explaining the crowd behavior is argued that it is not substantiated by factual observation. Sometimes the crowd behavior may be the expression of repressed drives, but it may not be true of all the crowds. Moreover, it is unable to explain all the features of crowd behavior. Now let us talk about Alport's theory. F. H. Alport has also criticized MacDougall's theory of sympathetic induction of emotion and behavior. He offered the explanation of crowd behavior by two principles, of which one is the principle of social facilitation. According to this principle, a common stimulus prepares two individuals for the same response, and when they are so prepared, the sight of one making that response releases and heightens that response in the other. The second principle is that of interstimulation. Now let us discuss about Turner's theory. Sociologist Ralph Turner has gone beyond inadequate psychological explanation of the crowd behavior and developed an emergent norm perspective. The central thesis of this perspective is that even in the most violent and dangerous crowds, there is also social interaction in which a situation is defined. Norms for sanctioning behavior emerge and lines of action are justified and agreed upon. Thus, all explanations throw light on either one or the other factor of the complex phenomena of crowd behavior. As such, they are incomplete and insufficient. There are multiple factors such as anonymity, stimulation, emotionality, suggestibility, initiation, contagion, lack of volition, force of unconscious impulses, etc., which are responsible for the emergence of the typical behavior of the crowd. The theory of crowd behavior has moved away from the older perspective, that of MacDougall and Lebon, that viewed the individual as coming under the away of the crowd and losing his capacity for rational judgment before the sweep of an overpowering emotional contagion. Instead, sociologists now explain crowd behavior by the same sociological concepts that explain social group behavior. Now let us discuss about crowd control. Considering the goal is to disperse the mob of armed protesters, law enforcement agencies have a few methods to choose from. Law enforcement agencies need to consider carefully what course of action to take. They need to remember it really depends on the threat level. Mob psychology shows that there are always some leaders in the mob who have a major influence on the crowd, and also pacifiers or mediators who are more rational and understanding than the other members. The law enforcement agencies need to identify these people amongst the crowd and try to negotiate with them or urge them to maintain a control over the crowd. If the leaders are aggressive and threaten to take things in their own hand, law enforcement agencies must try to control these leaders and prevent the situation out of their hand. Even after repeated warnings, if the crowd does not relent, the police should use minimum force to block the crowd or divert them from the path by using shields and batons. If the crowd starts becoming violent, use of tear gas, water hose and rubber bullets are also advisable. Arms and ammunition should be used in rarest of rare cases when there is a serious threat of injury or death to the police officers or other people. While controlling the crowd, law enforcement agencies need to be patient and persuasive on one hand while being active and swift on the other hand. They need to understand the psychology of the crowd while dealing with them. The leader of the police force needs to be a good decision maker and also impartial while dealing with two parties. There are numerous techniques designed to provide the commander with flexibility of action in accomplishing crowd control. The commander must select a combination of techniques that will produce the desired results within the framework of the selected crowd control options. Now I will discuss the most common techniques used for crowd control. First technique is observation. Observation consists of the deployment of individuals or teams to the outermost region of a crowd for the purpose of monitoring the crowd's activity. It includes gathering information on crowd size, location and mood, and reporting on the developing situation. Another technique is communication of interest and intent in certain situations. Effective communication with crowd leaders and participants may enable the force to control the situation without resorting to more severe actions. When planned and organized demonstrations, marches or rallies within the disturbed area are announced, the control force commander, in coordination with local authorities, should meet with the activity organizers to communicate the interest of the control forces. The commanding officer and local authorities should communicate to the activity organizers their intent to cope with violence, unlawful actions and violations of restriction imposed on the activity. It is intended that by this communication between activity organizers and control force personnel, the demonstration rarely or parade will occur without incident through the mutual cooperation of all concerned. The intentions of control forces will not be effective if delivered as an ultimatum. A limited begrudging dialogue with activity organizers reduces the opportunity for authorities to learn the plans of the demonstrators. It must be remembered that if this communication is not effective, the activity organizer might hold the demonstration in defiance of local authorities. Another technique is channelization. Where communications have been established with the dissident leadership and the intent and nature of the crowd activity is known in advance, pressure may be brought to bear on the leaders. This will channel the crowd into an area that will minimize the disruption that the crowd might have on the community, and that will facilitate the operations of the control force. Another technique is diversion. Consideration may be given to efforts to divert the leadership of the crowd itself from its stated or apparent objective. This effort is greatly facilitated if communications exist with the leadership of the crowd. This technique may be either direct, denying access to an area, or indirect, promoting an alternate site or activity of greater interest to the crowd. The diversion should support the objectives of the control force either by reducing the intensity of the crowd situation or by motivating the crowd to seek an area more easily controlled by the control force. Another technique is cooperation. The control force must seek to obtain the cooperation of the dissident leadership, which will decrease the potential for disruption. Also, when crowd leadership seeks permission and cooperation from the local government, officials should maximize this opportunity. This may be accomplished by talking the leadership into a cooperative planning effort designed to facilitate the protesters' opportunity to peacefully demonstrate. This will also establish guidelines that will minimize the impact of the demonstration on the community. Another technique is proclamation of dispersal orders. Sometimes law enforcement agencies need to call upon members of the group to disperse to their homes immediately. A proclamation establishes the illegal nature of the crowd's actions and is an excellent medium to make known to a crowd the intentions of the control force. The intent of a dispersal order is to permanently disperse a crowd, not to merely relocate the problem. It should be made clear that the crowd is expected to immediately leave the area and include a warning that force may be used which may inflict significant pain or result in serious injury. The dispersal order must be given in a manner reasonably believed to be heard and understood by the intended audience. Based upon the circumstances, law enforcement may need to consider multiple announcements from various locations. Dispersal orders may be delivered in languages that are appropriate for the audience. Regardless of how delivered, law enforcement should record the name of the individual making the statement and the date and time each order was administered. Dispersal orders should not be given until control forces are in position to support crowd movement. Methods that may be used to deliver and document dispersal orders includes loud speech, amplified sound, display of signage indicating unlawful assembly and dispersal, gaining the attention of the crowd and documenting affirmative responses of crowd members prior to the declaration of unlawful assembly, positioning law enforcement personnel to the rear of a crowd to confirm and document hearing the transmission of the dispersal order, acquiring multiple language capability using video or audio recording equipments for documentation of the dispersal order. Another technique is show of force. A show of force may be effective in various situations in civil disturbances control operations. Marching a well-equipped and highly disciplined control force in view of an assembled crowd may be all that is needed to persuade dissidents to disperse and retire peacefully from the scene. In other situations, however, a show of force may have a counterproductive effect. It may cause more persons to be attracted to the show and provoke a non-violent crowd into a violent confrontation. When personnel are scattered throughout the disturbance area in small groups, a show of force may take the form of motor marches throughout the area, saturation patrolling, and the manning of static posts. Another technique is apprehension of crowd members. The apprehension of an individual can only be justified if that person is in violation of the law. Situations may arise in a crowd control mission where large numbers of persons are participating in unlawful activities. The dispersal of such groups might result in greater violence or militant acts. Factors may exist that preclude the use of water or riot control agents, thus necessitating the containment of the crowd in a given area or the apprehension and removal of those crowd members committing unlawful acts. Wherever possible, military forces should allow civil police officers to perform the actual apprehension, processing and detention of civilian law violators. However, conditions of necessity may require these functions to be performed by military personnel. The most successful law enforcement strategy for dealing with mass arrests and bookings is proper planning, training, and comprehensive briefing of involved peace officers prior to the event. Mass arrests are dynamic situations that are resource intensive. Any process must be flexible enough to handle challenges that may confront the field force. Police should be prepared to utilize various arrest tactics to address unlawful behavior, including passive, non-compliant resistance, active resistance, and assaultive and life-threatening confrontation. Police should maintain accountability of arrestees from the arrest site, that is the crime scene, through the booking process. Many cases are lost due to the inability to match up to the arresting peace officer to the arrestee. The arrest report should articulate each arrestee's specific criminal act and the witnessing officers. This process will aid in criminal prosecution and the reduction of civil liability. A coordinate effort by all involved criminal justice entities is essential to ensure proper arrest, booking, and prosecution of violators. Maintain accountability of evidence. Consideration should be given to maintain evidence beyond criminal prosecution pending potential civil litigations. Another technique is use of barriers. Barriers can be effectively used to channel crowd and prevent vehicles from being driven near areas which are at a risk of greater damage, like government institutions. Another technique is employment of water. Water from a fire hose may be effective in moving small groups on a narrow front, such as a street, or in defending a barricade or roadblock. Personnel applying water should be protected by the control force and in some instances by shields. A water dispersing system specifically designed for use in civil disturbances operations is not included in the Navy supply inventory, but may be improvised from existing items of equipment. Water may be employed in a flat trajectory, that is in a solid stream, or as a high trajectory weapon, that is employing water as rainfall. The latter is highly effective during cold weather. The use of a large water tank 750 to 1000 gallons and a mounted water cannon will enable the force to employ water as they advance. By having at least 2 such trucks, one can held in reserve, aboard ship water hoses can be laid out in advance. The fire stations to be used will usually be indicated by their location, including the availability of cover for those teams. Past actual experience has shown that aqueous film forming AFF has had a disorienting effect on crowds and has increased the effectiveness of firefighting from the ship when objects on or to the pier, including vehicles and mooring lines, were set afire by the crowds. In the use of water, as with other measures of force, certain restraints must be applied. Avoid using water on innocent bystanders. Provide avenues of escape and use the more severe flat trajectory application only when necessary. Another technique is riot control agents. The use of riot control agents like tear gas and rubber bullets is an effective method of dispersing crowds. Remember, however, that effects of riot control agents are only temporary and will not prevent the reformation of a crowd in either the same or a different location. Riot control agents have many advantages over other techniques in that they have an immediate effect on large groups of people without causing any permanent harm. Riot control agents, when properly used by the control force, will disperse large crowds without actual contact with rioters. An understanding of riot control agents, their capabilities and limitations is mandatory for safe and efficient use. The authority to order the use of riot control agents rests with the installation commander. We can conclude that the knowledge of mob psychology and methods of crowd control is a must for every law enforcement officer. It will help them to handle critical situations and minimize loss of life and property during such situations. Human rights violations will also be reduced and avert criticism from both the public and media to a large extent. Thank you.